Oh,
Stephen,
hello.
was that like super slow for you? Or was it just a weird effect on my end? It was like counting down. Those were not seconds. It felt a little bit
Well, I
endless.
think didn't
Good
they just
morning.
aren't scientists just about to announce a new way of measuring the second? Maybe they've done that and the second is actually longer now, so everything is slowing down.
It
I
felt
think that is the
eternal.
case here.
Good morning. How are you, Stephen? And hi,
Pretty good, but I'm
everybody.
still talking too fast, so I guess it's not true that they changed the second.
Very well.
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I got to tell you, I'm finding it hard to get super into programming these days. There's just too much going on in the world. There always is, obviously, so many things going on in the world that it's just a matter of what you pay attention to. But this Elon Musk and Twitter thing also has me just
Oh,
irritated,
yeah,
endlessly
very
irritated, partly
irritating.
because, as some of you may know, I'm really good at getting on my high horse, on my soapbox, and taking dramatic positions, like criticizing Larry Ellison and Safra Katz and announcing I'm not going to do anything on Facebook. And I got to say, if they bring back everybody who's been banned, I won't even use names, who's been banned on Twitter, bring them back, I'll have a hard time staying there. And I hate to miss my, exit from my community, but
Oh, Stephen, we would miss you on Twitter. I understand that you'd want to do that, but I think your community and your
sure,
what am
right.
I calling them? Your
Trade-offs.
fans would miss you. So and
Just like
wouldn't
Facebook.
you? Yeah, you'd miss it too, wouldn't you?
I would miss it. That's right. So anyway, no decisions yet, folks. We'll see what happens. But I don't have lot of high hopes. And generally, my feeling about these people like Zuckerberg and Musk and so on is that they probably read a lot of the same science fiction books that I did growing up, but they're fiction. It doesn't mean you're supposed to be like that. And these billionaires who are running our world these days, too young, immature, just not doing good stuff for humanity or the planet. Okay, sorry. This is an InSum webcast. It's not a Stephen webcast.
Correct.
Let's move it along. So I thought I'd focus on something that seems so simple and transparent. Why would you even do a whole little Feuertip on it? But I will. It's called commit. We're going to talk about committing data in our applications and in code today, and some of the complications or features actually available to do that. Because as I explored, I realized there's even a lot more than I remembered, even though there were scripts that I wrote that I was now re-remembering. So before getting into code and so on and so forth, I say the most fundamental point about committing data. So the fundamentals are I can make changes in my code, insert into this table, delete from that table, and so on. Nobody else can see the impact of those changes until I commit the changes into the database. Then it's the current state of the data, and everybody who has access to those tables can see those rows, right? So I get to work in my own little private space, my session, and then I commit it availability to all sessions. Sorry, I did an interview earlier and my voice is kind of raspy. So that's a nice fundamental aspects of databases, because obviously it's all about storing data. You want to store good data, then you only want to allow it to be seen by others when you're ready. And it also is tightly linked up to the concept of a transaction, right? So generally speaking, a transaction are a series of changes to the database that are all or nothing. They go together all in one, or none of them go. And the transaction is a critical aspect of our applications, and the commit is what determines the transaction. And of course, there's also rollback. You can roll back your unsaved changes. Maybe I'll do a whole separate thing on rollback, though I don't think there's quite as much to talk about there. Okay, so here's the thing. In general, I would suggest that the commit keyword, the commit statement, should not appear in your backend code. In general, inside a procedure or a function, you shouldn't commit. Now, there are exceptions to that. But a lot of the code that we write is being utilized by some front-end environment to do stuff for a user at the command of the user. And in general, it's up to the user to say, I'm ready, submit my changes, which is usually writes and commits at the same time. And there can be a lot of complications if you take that on yourself. If you put commits in your code, you're defining a transaction boundary. Sometimes that's really good. That makes a lot of sense. Sometimes it can be very disruptive. So I would just put that out as a general caution that for the most case, you shouldn't be putting commits in your code. Okay, so from there, why don't you share my screen and let's start looking at some different interesting aspects of doing commits. Okay, so first of all, let's suppose that you've decided that, Stephen, you're right. There should never be commits in my code. You can actually tell Oracle database to not allow a commit to be executed from inside your stored code. Here we go. You can say alter session. And I have to admit, I haven't tried to do this for alter procedure for a specific program unit, but I say alter session, disable commit in procedure. And then let's make sure I'm connected here while I'm talking through this. It's reconnecting. Now, good. Notice I have a procedure that does a commit, and then I'll disable it. I'll try to do it with disable, then I'll enable commit and see if it'll work. And now do we have a reconnection? We don't. Come on. I hate when that happens. Now, the interesting thing about this is you can see references to this feature on the internet. I wrote this script ages ago and forgot about it completely. I imagine you're not going to use it very often. Anyway, in the comments that I've seen online, they talk about how this being a useful feature for testing, because as you might know, if I'm doing some testing, I don't have some robust testing framework in place. If I run all my code, I run all my tests, and my code has a commit in it, the changes are saved to the tables, which means I have to basically rebuild the tables for the next test. Whereas if I don't commit, then I can just do a rollback and run my test again. So here, let's run this code, and so we're going to disable commit, create a table if it's not already there. I'm not even sure why I'm doing that. Why am I doing that? Okay, let's run my code. So when I tried to execute this procedure, I got a runtime cannot commit in current session. And if I enable it back on, then no problem. Procedure completed. So if you ever did decide that the standard in your environment is that we're not running any background jobs that do commits themselves, all our code is being utilized via API in the front end, it really might be worthwhile saying, you know what, we're not going to let commits happen just in case somebody stuck one in there. Now, in terms of using this technique to help you facilitate testing because you haven't committed, I don't think so, because what it's doing is raising an exception or a 34 error, telling you cannot commit. So I would think that if you really wanted a testing feature, in other words, when I'm testing, I don't want to commit, you wouldn't change this because that would actually change the behavior of your program here. You would actually do something else. So in fact, let's move on to what I suggest as an alternative technique. But just so you know, you can actually turn off commits inside your stored program units. Now, suppose you did have a situation where people were writing commits and you wanted to do some testing. And ideally, since you didn't have this whole regression framework set up that automatically rebuilt your database environment, I'm going to modify a few tables when I run my code, but then I just want to see the results and then roll them back. I'd like to be able to do that even though my production code has to commit. That's the thing. So I have to have a commit at the end. I don't want the commit while I'm testing. Too often what we'll do is comment out the commit and then uncomment it, just like we do with DBMS output. Put in 1,000 trace calls, then comment them all out before I go to production. You never want to test your code, get it all working, and then go make some changes at the last minute to get it back to production state. So alternatively, what you could do is create a package like mycommit. Mycommit is an API to commit. And so we have, for example, a perform commit procedure. So instead of you issuing the commit statement, you would issue the perform commit procedure. You would execute the perform commit procedure. You can pass in a message saying, here's what I'm doing. So it gives you some context. And of course, we can add all sorts of context like DBMS utility call stack. So if I'm tracing, it automatically traces my commits. And then if committing is enabled, commit. And if I've turned off committing, so if I say do not commit, then I will not commit. So basically, during my testing, I just say turn off commits, mycommit.turnoff, run my code. It does everything it would have done before except the commit. And then I can roll back and run my test again. You can even do things like build in incremental testing, commit after n number of counts, all sorts of different things that you can add. And again, this is a classic mini example of the advantage you get by building a layer of code around some built-in feature, because then you get to intervene before the actual built-in is executed, and you can do other stuff. I wrote this package a long time ago. There we go, 1996, way back when I was with Quest Software. That's not a really valid copyright anymore. I don't think so. Anyway, you're welcome to use it. It's in my demo zip. I don't know that anybody ever has used it, but I kind of like the idea. I actually haven't used it in my applications. Okay, so you can disable commits through this declarative approach, but that will literally cause errors to be raised. If you're just looking for a way to turn on and off commits selectively for testing purposes, you might use something like the mycommit API. Do make sure that the default behavior is, yes, we are committing when commit is called. Otherwise, that could lead to problems.
Stephen, we have a question from
Okay.
Eric. How about a commit in an execute immediate? Is that considered in procedure or in SQL?
So the question is, if I do this, so this says stored program. So in fact, let's do it this way. You don't even have to do execute immediate. Let's just try that first. So disable commits. Do a commit, no problem. And then you're asking if I say execute immediate, begin, commit, end. Try that. You just have to get it right. What did I get wrong? Anybody see what I did wrong?
You need a semicolon after your execute immediate.
Right. So many semicolons, so little time. Here we go, no problem. So it literally is saying, if you've got a stored program unit in the database, I assume it means function as well. That's Oracle generally uses procedure as a shorthand for stored program code, programmatic code, PL/SQL code, only for those, not for things that are executed in an anonymous block. Other questions?
Nope.
Okay. Then let's switch over to Live SQL to look at some scripts. Where'd you go, Firefox? Here you are. So here's a question for the group. Why don't you stop sharing my screen for a sec? Let's pull me back up so I can see you. So here's a question for everybody to think about while I start doing some exploring in Live SQL. Do you know about ways that Oracle, or when will Oracle automatically commit on your behalf without you even asking to do it? So think about that for a minute while I look at these other questions. There are certainly a lot of comments here. There's Eric's question.
Eamon, just after you asked if there were any other questions, and I said no, Eamon came in with one.
So remember, think about it. When does Oracle automatically commit for us? Okay. What if I need to manage the transaction when I have a procedure and a third-party reset service? Well, that's a very interesting question, Eamon. What if I need to manage the transaction? So a transaction now is involving the stored procedure call and a third-party REST service related to workflow. And I need to manage both sides, my database, if third-party failed, roll back the procedure. So first of all, if you've issued a commit, if your third-party program issues a REST call to the database, execute a stored procedure, and it does a commit, can't roll that back. You can try to restore to a previous point in time with flashback query and things like that, but there's no way to roll back once the commits happened. If the third party fails, and so Eamon, that's my general comment. I'm not sure about some of the details of what you wrote, so why don't you follow up with an additional comment or question if you have a concern, or if I can help you further. And I have an answer from Jamal. So when does Oracle automatically commit for us? After DDLs. Is that all, Jamal? Is that all you can think of? But you're right. Oracle will automatically commit after a DDL is executed, but that's not all. So let's take a look at that. Please share my screen. So inside Live SQL, which hopefully you're all familiar with, I've done a search for commit. And we'll look at a number of things here, but let's look at this one. As you can see from the title, Jamal, you were partly correct, and it's what I believe for a long time. Actually, it's a little bit different from that. Oracle will execute a commit before you try to execute the DDL statement, and then afterwards, if the DDL statement succeeded, which is pretty interesting.
And you didn't know that.
Sorry?
You didn't knew that.
I didn't know that?
You did. You did.
Oh, Judith knew that?
Yes.
Well, yeah, Judith knows so much about Oracle database. Really, seriously, way more than I do for sure. Yes, that's right. And it wasn't something, I think that I might have published a quiz on the PL/SQL Challenge years ago. And somebody then commented, might have been Judith, that in fact there are 2 commits. So in fact, it'll execute a commit beforehand as well as after, and the script will show you the details of, basically verifying that's true. And then there's another interesting aspect to that, which was introduced by Frank Pachot, who was a fantastic Oracle database pro. I think he worked for CERN, but he has since joined the dark side and went to Postgres. It's not that dark. No, Yugabyte. He went to Yugabyte along with Bryn Llewellyn. But anyway, he noticed that there's something very interesting about the DDL committing, that it depends on the commits depend on the type of failure that might occur. So it turns out that if you have an invalid statement, so for example, here I'm trying to create a table named table, and I get an error invalid table name, then it will not have done the commit. See, I've got an insert, tried to do the DDL statement. The basic idea is it couldn't even get started. It wasn't a valid statement. So when I roll back, it literally rolled back the row inserted. But if I try to insert into the demo table, so that's a valid statement, but it turns out that there's already a table named demo, then the commit has occurred. Interesting little nuance there. Okay. So generally executing DDL, so data definition, language, create table, create index, create and replace stored procedures, those are things that we do pretty rarely in production applications for a good reason. You can have all sorts of follow-on impacts of recompiling a program unit, for example, or creating a new program unit, changing it, because there's a lot of dependency, automated dependency management in the database. So it's something we're very wary of doing, but do realize that when you execute that statement, any outstanding changes in your session will be committed with some of these exceptions we talked about. Questions on that?
Nope.
Okay. I'm just going through my list here from the blog post that we will publish shortly. Okay. My commit. Right. Now, another really important thing to remember about commits has to do with exceptions. This is more to do with rollback, I suppose, than commit. But the one very important thing to remember is that when an exception occurs in your code, it does not automatically roll back any uncommitted changes. So, for example, here I've got a piece of code in which I do an update of all the employees. I said, everybody's salary to 10,000. And then I try to do a more selective update. And then I get an error, value too large for column. But notice that the count, the SQL% count, which is right here, how many people are making $10,000? Everybody in the table. So notice that this update failed. I displayed the error message, and then I continued. So the exception did not come out unhandled from the block. If it came out unhandled all the way back to the host environment, in this case Apex, then a rollback occurs in my session. But if I trap it locally, in other words, outside the block, there's no evidence of this exception right now, then inside this block of code, any outstanding DML changes still remain to be committed. Okay. So exceptions do not affect that transaction aspect of our code. And then, of course, as I'm sure a lot of you know, you can also restrict autonomous. When it comes to committing, generally speaking, it's all or nothing, right? If I issue a commit in my code, it will save all the changes outstanding in my session, whether or not it was done in this block or a previous block executed, doesn't matter. Sometimes, however, we want to narrow down the scope of the commit, and that can be done with the autonomous transaction pragma. And this, the demonstration in Live SQL is pretty much the canonical example. I want to log an error out to my log table, and then I want to roll back my transaction because something went wrong. I don't want to roll back the insert into my log table. So the way I do that here is add a pragma autonomous transaction. A pragma is a compiler directive, so it's a command at the compile time, no runtime overhead to doing this. And it basically says that when I commit, and I have to commit if I've made any changes, then when I commit, I only commit the changes in this subprogram and any subprograms it called along the way, like putline. But all the rest of the changes in my environment are not yet committed, right? So that gives you some granularity over when and where the commits are taking place. Again, that can be very dangerous because what I'm doing is segmenting out the transaction. Now, in this case, makes perfect sense, right? writing my message out to the log is not a part of my transaction per se, not a part of my application or business transaction. So it makes sense to tuck it away, do the commit, and get back to my work. It may be to continue on and finally do a commit. It may be to roll back. But if you start using Pragma Autonomous Transaction all over the place and putting in commits in various parts of your application, you might then be causing problems because, let's say, one execution flow, A calls B calls C, doesn't do any commits. A calls B calls Q calls C. Oh, Q does a commit. And suddenly, what you thought was a valid transaction is now perhaps broken. Maybe I got all the way to Q, did a commit, went to C, and got a rollback, but it didn't roll back all the other stuff. So be very careful about where you put these autonomous transactions. Make sure that you always keep in mind or ask yourself, what is the transaction for the user? And then make sure that your code matches that logic. Questions, comments?
No questions or comments.
Excellent.
I don't know how related this is, but I don't know if you've spoken to Anton at all recently. He put in a request to the Apex Ideas asking for the commit to become like a declarative setting on a process within Apex. So in terms of being able to control, what the transaction is, and I thought that was an interesting request to be able, because of course in Apex, if you've got a page and you've got multiple processes, if there's an exception that happens on any one of them, all the processes roll back. So the idea.
Oh man, you took my next point away. No, that's great.
I'm
Excellent
sorry.
segue. That's all right. So let's talk about committing in the context of Apex. Right?
Okay.
So in general, what we do is live in browsers, and we have browser-based applications that interact with the database behind the scenes. Apex is one example of a tool that does that. There are obviously many others like JavaScript and PHP and you name it. So of course, Apex is a database savvy environment. So one of the things that it really does for us nicely is transaction management. In general, let's put aside Apex for a moment. So if I was writing a JavaScript application on top of, let's say, Oracle database, in general, every time there's a server call, so from JavaScript, it executes a procedure, a PL/SQL procedure, executes it and comes back. In general, a commit takes place with every server round trip. That can lead to very interesting situations unless you're very careful about how you code all of your logic. In Apex, they make it really simple in that the assumption is that everything involved in a sequence of actions interacting with the database is part of one server call. I put together a really simple application to demonstrate this. Let's go into the check this out page. So I've created a tiny little table called, well, what is it called? We have to look at my procedure. So let's look at add to table. There's not much to it. Add to table. Here's what I'm adding. Do I want to commit? Do I want to raise an exception? So I insert into the table. I commit if I've requested that. And I raise an exception if I've requested that. Back to the application. So I've got a very simple API. Obviously, I just simply press submit or I empty the table. When I press submit, it runs a series of processes. So in the first step, I'm going to add a row to the table. I'm not going to commit. I'm not going to raise an exception. Second row, I'm going to put in the second row. I'm going to commit. I'm not going to raise exception. And then third, I'm going to not commit, and I'll raise an exception if I've asked to raise an exception. Let's take a look. So first of all, not raising an exception, I submit. And I get 3 rows in the table, right? So this one committed, this one inserted, not committed, this one inserted and committed, this one inserted and didn't commit and did not raise an exception. But notice, because that was the last server call, we went through the whole sequence, no errors, we got 3 rows. Let's empty the table. Now I'm going to raise an exception in that third step. Submit. We got an error. Refresh. Now just 2 rows. Okay. So the point here is that makes sense, right? First row, second row committed, third row insert, and then failure. But here's the point. These three in general in an Apex environment, I'm running a series of processes in response to a submission. That's the transaction. Either it all worked or it didn't. For me, by putting a commit inside one of these steps, I've now disrupted the integrity of that transaction. Maybe that's what you really wanted, but most likely it's not. So that's another example of where putting commits in your stored code, you wouldn't even see it here. Putting commits in stored code can be very disruptive to the management of the transaction for the end user. Again, sometimes you might want to commit in a certain step. And so Anton's idea of, I guess, adding an attribute to a process to say, is this a commit after the process executes? I think I like that because at least it's declarative and you can be very explicit about what you're doing. I've got to feel that it would not come up all that often, but why not? Why not have it as an option? But only if they do that one after mine. Okay, let's see. Let's
Jamal
go back to
has a
life cycle.
question. If
Right, go
we
ahead.
disable commits and procedures, does that affect front ends like Oracle Forms or ADF or Apex, I suppose?
So my understanding, Jamal, is that if you execute that alter session statement, it's saying whatever stored procedure you've got, if it's got a commit in it, we're going to raise an exception. So I'm sure that in Apex code, it would. Apex code is privileged in some ways, but not in terms of the basic language, really the environment in which it executes and how it's executed, using DBMS SysSQL instead of DBMS SQL, essentially. But as far as I know, it would happen across the board. Maybe the MTS architecture dominant web applications cannot avoid committing automatically. What's MTS? Not sure.
Edith, what's MTS?
What's MTS, Edith? So, yeah, I don't know. I think that I'm sure they could do things any number of ways. The problem is that if the server round trip really defines a transactional action with the database. See, the thing is with Apex, it's each one of those called multi-threaded server. Okay, thanks. Dominant. Cannot avoid committing automatically. Yeah, I'm sure there are all sorts of complications that certainly interact with the fact that there are connection pools and going in and out. But the fact is that each server call done and back, if you leave it uncommitted, how do you make sure to get back to it to commit, right? So if you got connection pooling, which I think is probably mostly the same thing as multi-threaded server reference, you might then on your next server call go to a different connection in the pool. And even if you committed, you wouldn't be committing those changes, you're committing other changes. So having a commit on the server call makes an awful lot of sense. No disagreement with that. It's another way of seeing the advantage of Apex, which is that it is so tightly connected with the database, it can manage what is a server call in a very flexible way compared to other environments. All right, wow, we're already 11:30. Amazing. And I think
Multi-threaded squirrel. Okay. All right, Rachel.
Sounds like Rachel might have dogs. If I say, get that squirrel.
Oh, gosh, please. Oh, no,
up.
that's what you can't hear.
So let me just see if there's anything else. Go ahead.
Niels, more interesting if you exchange your first two processes in Apex.
Change the
I guess
first
Niels,
two.
okay. Change the order?
Yeah. So you want to do that first. So now what Niels is saying, try it out where you commit first, then you don't commit on the second one. And then, all right, let's see.
Should I add your screen?
Yes, please. Thanks. Sorry. So what I did was move the second to the first. Saved it. Refresh my page. Don't raise an exception. Submit. 3. Raise an exception. So what do we think is going to happen now if an exception is raised? We've got this one committed. This one didn't. This one didn't. So how many do you think we'll see when we're done? One. Right, so in this case, we inserted the first one and committed, so we're done with that one, can't go back. But neither of these committed, and then the exception caused the rollback of both of these. So just one were inserted. All right, so listen, we're at 11:30. I encourage you to look for commit inside Live SQL, and hopefully you will not get an unexpected internal application. Woo!
Oh dear. Oh,
Just in time. Stop sharing my
we're
screen.
done. I will stop sharing your screen.
Okay, so on the one hand, commit is pretty straightforward. You got to commit semicolon statement, you execute it, you saved all your changes. On the other hand, it's really important to recognize when and where to include a commit. Make sure to remember the autonomous transaction pragma if you do want to do a commit, but you don't want it to cause a commit across your entire session. And seriously, if you don't have any sort of comprehensive testing framework set up, and you do have commits, you're doing a lot of back-end coding, jobs that need to commit when done and so forth, you have commits in your code, take a look at that My Commit package. It's on Live SQL as well. And you might find that to be really nice and flexible. And among other things, it'll trace out where you issued commits in your application. Which reminds me, there is one more thing I was going to show you, but it's on Live SQL. You can check it out. You can use PL Scope to actually find all the commits in your code. Commit is a type of statement, and you can just run a single query after you compile your code with PL Scope on, run a query against all the code in the all identifiers view, and you'll find all the places where commits occur. If it's 0, you're probably doing pretty well.
Stephen, you said your My Commit procedure was on Live SQL. You'd also mentioned it was part of your zip file. Is it in both?
Right. So you can go to stephenfeuerstein.com and download the zip file. It'll be there as well. Yep.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So thanks for joining us for the tip. I've asked Michelle to come up with a cultural artifact of the week. Michelle, take it away.
For which you judged me harshly too. So I think Stephen was expecting me to come on and share my favorite book of all time. I actually was going to share the book I'm currently reading. So I'm a bit of let me just see, there's a comment coming in and Carrie. All right. Thanks, Carrie. No, because I don't know if my echo is still on. Mark was telling me I have a really bad echo. So hopefully that's okay. All right. So Stephen, I'm a bit of a personal development junkie. My Kindle library is full of, I'm going to say 10, 15% read books on how to be better at all sorts of things. But there's one that I have in here, and I'm going to add it. Everybody Writes. This one is one that I just keep coming back to. I don't know if people know, one of the hats I wear at Insum is a marketing hat. And so writing is part of everything that I do. But I think it's part of, I think it's part of what most people do, right? Whether it's writing an email, a tweet, a newsletter, a blog post.
Comments in your code.
Comments in my code. So anyway, I'm learning a lot about this. I think a lot of it is actually having to unlearn a lot about, what we're taught in school. I went to a French lycée. The more words I could throw into a sentence, the more adjective, adverbs, the better it was. Whereas, Anne Handley tells you to keep things simple, inject humor. Anyway, I'm learning a lot. I keep coming back to it. Nuggets of gold. I think anybody that does any sort of writing, she's got a very nice way of teaching. Anyway, this is one that I'm really enjoying, and I think it's making me a better writer. You and I talk about writing a lot, and I always
it's making me a better writer too, because you're often giving me feedback on my writing and making it tighten up. In fact, I was telling Michelle that the main advice that Michelle gives me has to do with apostrophes. Use contractions. In today's world, it's like, don't say it will be the best. It'll be the best. So that's my main lesson.
You should write. Anne says you should write like you're talking to somebody. So if we're talking, you wouldn't say it will, you'll say it'll, or you are, you'll say you're. So that sort of thing. It says ridiculous. Okay, obviously she's a marketer.
Yeah,
there's
usually content is pretty bad.
I think there's something in there for everybody. And Stephen, it is not my favorite book of all time. It's a book I'm reading and enjoying now. I can come back and share my.
Yes. All right. Next Feuertip, it'll be one of your favorite books of all time, not your number one favorite. And so I'd be amazed if anybody had a number one favorite book.
Number one favorite.
Lots of favorites. All right. So thank you so very much for joining us. I'm glad. Hopefully this was helpful. Looks like a number of you learned some new things. And I'll be back in a couple of weeks with more Feuertips and another great cultural artifact recommendation from Michelle. Oh, and we'll also be donating $25 to help the Ukraine humanitarian efforts. And hopefully in 2 weeks, Putin will stop invading the Ukraine. Wouldn't that be nice? Probably not. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
See you next time. Thanks.